can't remember what the poem's called. Which kind of seismic movements in history.
Yeah, happy to bring others to bear. Yeah, happy to bring others to bear.
In the matter of ice, the invasions were partial, so that the frost was a beautiful head, the sky cloudy, and the day packed into the crystal as the thrust slowed and we come to a stand along the coast of Norfolk. That is a relative point, and since the relation was part to part, the gliding was cursive, a retreat followed by advance, right to North London. The moraine runs axial to the Finchley Road, including Hippopotamus, which isn't a joke any more than the present fringe of intellectual habit. They did live as the evidence is ready for the successive drift. Hunstanton to Wells is the clear margin from which hills rise into the interior. The stage is broken through by the lobe bent southwest into the wash and the sudden warmth which took birch trees up into Scotland. As the 50-degree isotherm retreats, there is that secular weather laid down in pollen, and the separable advances on Cromer easterly and on Gipping, mostly to the south. The striations are part of the heart's desire, the parkland of what is coast, inwards from which, rather than the reverse. And as the caps melted, the eustatic rise in the sea level curls round the clay, the base rise, what we hope to call land, and the curving spine of the Cretaceous ridge, masked as it is by the drift, is wedged up to the thrust, the ice fronting the earlier marine, so that the sentiment of cliffs is the weathered stump of a feeling into the worst climate of all. Or if that's too violent, then it's the closest balance that holds the tilt, land sea to ice cap from parkland, not more than 2 degrees to 3 degrees Fahrenheit. The oscillation must have been so delicate. Almost each counter on the rock spine is a weather limit, the ice smoothing the lumps off, filling the hollows with sandy clay as the litter of surface. As the roads run dripping across this, the rhythm is the declension of history, the facts in succession. They are succession. And as the limits are not time, but ridges and thermal delays, plus or minus whatever carbon dates we have, we are rocked in this hollow, in the ladle by which the sky, less cloudy now, rests on our foreheads. Our climate is maritime, and it is questionable whether there has yet been sufficient change in the marine faunas to justify a claim that the Pleistocene epoch has come to an end. We live in that question. It is a condition of fact. As we move, it adjusts the horizon, belts of forest, the Chilterns up into the wolds of Yorkshire, the falling movement, the light cloud blowing in front of the ice of Norfolk thrust. As the dew recedes from the grass towards noon, the line of recession slips back. We know where the north is. The ice is an evening whiteness. We know this. We are what it leaves. The Pleistocene is our current sense, and what in sentiment we are. We are the coast, a line or sequence, the cut back down to the shore.
I love that this is so almost asinine in its subject. Right, you know, this could almost be Wordsworth. I mean, this could almost be Wordsworth. Is hugely disingenuous, but it's a very classic poem, right? It's him sitting somewhere in Norfolk talking about the landscape, and he's talking about the landscape in several registers, right? He's talking about it in terms of geology and, you know, thermal stuff, but then he also puts it into a very linguistic context.
Yeah.
This line, as the roads run dripping across this, the rhythm is the declension of history, is it's just an astonishing line. Like I read this the other day and I just went over that. The rhythm is the declension of history. Like I really struggle to pass. Like the subject is presumably to read geological history within a landscape. But what is a declension here? Because that's usually a grammatical thing, right? That's a transition from one case to another. Now, I don't speak Latin.
There's
I mean,
something in declension. There's something about a transition from a case to another, and there's something to do with decline, literally as well. Like, and it feels to me there's a lot of like, you know, in this poem, there's a lot of stuff about the sort of the temperature change giving rise to like these loosenings. You know, like literally ice melting. That's a kind of and the erosion, um, and it's like it's sort of talking about our present moment or the present moment this poem was in, but really, you know, it's minutes ago in terms of seconds ago in terms of geological history.
yeah.
Us as the kind of late outcome of this, you know, enormous seismic movement, and something that I think is really important in this poem, which we touched on last time, which you talked about, which was the idea of sort of inhabiting contradiction, which is really starkly said in this poem. We live in that question. The Pleistocene epoch itself has come to an end. That quotation, I'd like to know where that's from. It's questionable whether there has yet been sufficient change in the maritime forms to justify a claim that. So we're living in the question of whether the Ice Age has actually ended. And I've heard geologists speak about this and climatologists and all sorts, you know, like this thing of like, you know, the ice is gone, but does that mean that that change in the climate, you know, that movement is not necessarily over? I think that's pretty commonly understood that change in temperature is still happening, and that's I'm not going to go all climate change denier on you, like, you know, obviously
I mean,
that's being accelerated by us.
The argument, I think.
Sorry.
That's the reason we both know the argument about the Ice Age not closing is because of climate change denial.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure Jeremy isn't alluding to at this time, because I don't think climate change was as well understood as it is now, enough to have idiots.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful and it's very plaintive.
Plaintives, right? Yeah. Well, yeah. It's with these poems where they're quite they're dense, but they are syntactically they're not as difficult to follow as like stuff that comes later. I mean, they're complicated and they seem to build up theses, but it's interesting plaintive. It's like, what's the kind of sound of this poem? There's something sonorous about it, even though it's so kind of formal in a certain sense of scientific, descriptive, linguistic, technical language.
I was going to say something about like the complexity there, and sort of go to the streak-willing entourage.
I've been sorting out my pamphlets and I've got the Prynne pile. I find it very hard to find much to say about Speak Winning Entourage Artesian, I must say.
Well, I mean, that's kind of why I was bringing it to bear, because we're talking about the transition. Have you got the one that's like a sort of a sideways oblong? Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. So that was sat in my what would you call it? I had a thing at a job I used to have, like a locker, and it was sat in there for years, just kind of occasionally coming out, and me just kind of going, "Fuck me, this doesn't make any sense at all." But just to sort of say how far he came in order to get to these sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting tracing that, because it doesn't happen. People often talk about like late Prynne as this kind of stage in his work. I actually think there are a few different phases within that, and it doesn't just happen as this kind of. I used to think about it as a kind of almost entropy of connectives and syntax, and Prynne's sort of very clearly hammered out a sort of poetics of non-connective sense making, almost in a sort of linear sense, like especially in his last book, one of his last books, of Breath of Scrap, it's kind of almost playful with this way of like these words are just going to sort of sit next to each other, and reading linearity and getting meaning from that linearity is, well, it's not going to be the way that you're going to understand these poems, but it drifts backwards and forwards a bit through the earlier phases, It's just interesting to try and follow it, because I don't think it's quite as straightforward as it just.
I always object to that, the idea that there is different categorically distinct areas of a given individual's work. I think a person is capable of enormous diversity, and I think Prynne is definitely an example of that. Like, he's, well, in some senses, but he's never going to turn to the world's wife or something like that, is he? He's never going to turn to like an Andrew Motion type poem. He's always going to have this density and this high illusion, and there's a reason he's a high modernist poet, or a late modernist poet rather, according to the back of this book, is because he exhibits many of the qualities of modernist poetry. But I think, when people okay, sort of a slightly trite example, but when people are a bit like, I can't believe that Morrissey turned into the person he did. Now, on the one hand, I don't want to sort of belittle people's attachment to Morrissey, because it's incredibly important that who he was for a lot of people, particularly in the early 80s. On the other hand, I find it slightly credulous to, like, he's got some racist songs that were demos from prior to the Smiths, right? And the fact that he's now gone full fascist, like, he always played with that. He was always close to that world, and so to suggest discrete areas of Morrissey or a complete change which led him to become a fascist. I mean, there's another person I don't really want to talk about, but I'll talk about it with you privately. But I'm sure you can imagine someone who has previously been like an anarchist or a communist who suddenly turns into I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, even. But I think we can find germs of those things.
And I think, I don't know, it's traceable back. I do find in Prynne's work, I do find that I really, and I'm very open to saying this, I don't know what's going on with a lot of the most recent stuff. Like I think this book of Better Scrap is like really interesting in these terms. We had a day where Jeremy came down to Brighton and we spoke about the book for many hours. I'd say maybe about 12 hours or something. It was, like we started in the middle of the day and we ended very early in the morning. And lots of different stuff came out of that day. But I wrote a kind of introductory, sort of improvised paper just saying, I feel kind of coldly excluded from this work. I feel like it's very aggressive towards the reader. And as the day went on, certain other people in the group were saying, well, actually, this work is kind of incredibly playful. There's kind of possible reading to like actually loose yourself of the. I was kind of accused of trying to naturalize the first poem in it. Like this is a term that Veronica Forrest Thompson uses to talk about like trying to make naturalized readings of poems to try and like use the kind of structure of a different poetics to make sense of a poetics which isn't trying to engender that kind of sense making. So like the first poem in this book, no, actually I won't go there. Let's I don't know.
I mean, is
Trying to naturalize some of Streak Willing, for example, inside the tight closed box, off it was out. A same summer box, oh then it must closed on all, or maybe often maybe open to one side glaze, be in part to spill a firm parted along a rim bellow. It's like how I could go into those things and try and make a sort of, I guess, a sketch, of the things that are happening here. But I think that a lot of the poetics for me feels like the power of the language is in the associations that are sort of hung up next to each other. Maybe I still don't know what to do with that though. I still don't know what it's meant to be for. And I think whether however hard we try to escape the conditions of our reading, it's going to be a strain. It's going to take a long time. It could take me years to try and find something intelligent to say about this.
So I kind of want to talk. I want to say two things on the back of that. One is you said cold there, but I wonder if frigidity is somehow more appropriate. I mean, because cold to me implies a certain kind of prohibitive, like you can't get into it. Whereas maybe frigid is like it's actually somehow. I mean, obviously, frigid has a very particular connotation in terms of sexuality, but also it kind of means a sort of I don't know, an unwillingness or a stillness or a impermeability.
Impermeability. How do you mean?
Well, maybe impermeability. I mean,
frigid impermeability.
Yeah, I mean, okay. Well, to start with, like, there's not a problem with poetry being cold. There's not a problem with poetry being prohibitive. Like everything doesn't have to invite its reader all the time. It doesn't have to be scrutable at all times. And Prynne, if anyone, has been gentle and tender and beautiful without being performatively inviting. So if later on it ceases to be beautiful in that sense, then that's not inconsistent. It's not incongruent with his work in general. But impermeable and frigid, I guess, in that context, are talking about, is Prynne inviting a reader? Is he inviting that reader to identify themselves with the words, with the form, with the context, with the connotations, with the allusions, or is he merely I don't know, merely offering words or offering poems? Like, they have form, right? They are poems. They're not great.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's like maybe offering quite, you know when like it's like there's a door out of this closed room, but you don't see it for ages, but then it's when you do, it's like so obvious. Um, uh, I do feel like there's a sense of like perhaps being like, I've climbed a bit higher on this, I'm a few stories up from you on this building and I can see a bit further down the road. I do feel like there's something like that in there where, whether that's true or not, but
I mean, is that a context, like having that sort of perspective on it that would I mean, okay, maybe a different question is like how many secondary texts are going to render a reading group unnecessary? I mean, that's like the title of a Prynne parody, isn't it? Sketch for a theory of how many secondary texts would render J.H. Prynne scrutable.
Yeah.
I
suppose it's like, for me, it's like, when I come to those poems, like, what kind of scrutability am I trying to make? Because it feels like it is me imposing it. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to want to put on something that you're reading, though. I think that's quite a normal thing, But maybe that's what naturalization means. I think that term is a bit strange, actually. Naturalization. I feel like it does sort of depict like a desperation for a previous framework to fit something which is absolutely resisting many of the frameworks that it's lived within. There we go. That takes us back. That's a nice segue back to the beginning. The unnatural frame, living within the unnatural frame. Yeah.
I mean,
this poetry maybe the self-composed in this poetry and this later part, like it really does live within an unnatural frame for itself,
I mean, poetry. I'll phrase that as a question: is poetry natural? I mean, because I feel no. I feel quite strongly no. I feel we're talking about this idea of different times and contradictions within the poem we read, the slightly sort of earlier one. We're talking about these different types, and poetry is very clearly it's an artifice, right? It's in writing. It's not reflective of nature. It's reflective of our reflection upon nature. The geology of Norfolk is not represented by Prynne. It's represented for humans by Prynne, or represented for narrow context by Prynne. I don't think nature is represented by poetry, or except insofar as it's re-represented.
Representation is a funny term, isn't it? It's like I prefer something that comes closer to like inhabiting.
Yeah.
It's that doesn't make that kind of colossal distinction. That poetry is there to put things on display. I think it's just as much there to like inhabit them and turn them upside down, inside out, destroy them, rebuild them. Yeah, I mean, I think an interesting thing about that glacial question poem is that, coming back to what we were saying about like I can't remember what word you used, but plaintive, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
That sense is there, and I feel like there's a lot of beauty in poems of that era. A kind of, I'm going to say sonorous again, but and I think plaintive in that case particularly, beauty speaking into kind of deep time, and I do think that's quite an incredible thing, to be able to speak with a kind of scientific knowledge, into. I mean, it almost feels romantic on some level, you know. Like, I mean, not obviously in terms of the sublime, but also there's a personal kind of sense here, and that goes back to our conversation about like who the subject and the poet is. And I feel like there is like a really sentimental self reacting to these huge questions, you know. I find that really beautiful. I find it refreshing in this poetry.
Yeah, I would definitely.
And it's very much, you know, like he's very much against triviality. You know, it's like, you know, in a very early interview, you know, like he says something about how nobody should like. The strongest feeling about poetry is that one should not dabble. That it's not something to be trivialized, you know, to be witty or pithy or whatever. And in a more recent interview, kind of really reinforced that even harder by just kind of promising that he would try to never be merciful.